Joining us now is ex-diplomat Pyotr Kurzin, a geopolitical expert and podcast host. Given that Iran and Russia's 2025 partnership treaty lacks a mutual defense clause, how much can Tehran realistically expect Moscow to help if the U.S. carries out strikes?
Well, it's good to be with you. I would say not very high. The Russians have never followed through on any of their existing agreements. We've seen this in Syria, we've seen this in Armenia, we've seen this obviously with Venezuela. Now, the Kremlin tends to have a very large vocal strategy, but when it means actually acting on that with tangible assets, never really happens. And in this case, even though Iran is arguably the most important strategic partner Russia has from, say, a military standpoint, China's slightly different. I don't think Moscow can do it purely because they don't have the bandwidth. Moscow is completely bogged down in Ukraine, and for them to conduct any meaningful sort of engagement to help Iran would require a significant reallocation of resources, time, focus, which Putin and the military just don't have. Moreover, there are rumblings, shall we say, of a power struggle between the FSB or the security services and the military part of the defense areas of the Russian government as well. So things are not great for Putin.
Right. Russia has condemned U.S. threats and it's warned of regional instability, but those are words. Once again, they're not actions. So what forms of support for Iran are most likely from Russia in a real crisis?
Well, I can't think of anything more than the current crisis that Iran is facing. It has, in some ways, I call it a triple header. It has its domestic situation, its geopolitical pressures, but also the economy and the water shortages, which are arguably part of the core reasons Iran is facing what it is right now at home. So for Moscow to get involved in this will significantly, as I say, require the reallocation of a lot of resources. But I just don't think it's going to happen. And the Iranians would expect some kind of perhaps air support. They would expect some kind of military aid. We've seen the Russians deliver this to the Syrians in the past during the early days of the civil war and getting involved after the Turkish got involved as well in 2015 when there was that infamous jet being downed. But in this case, I can't see other than really strong words.
I guess the final question is, what would an Islamic Republic regime collapse ultimately mean for Russia?
Well, it's quite ironic, really. A few years ago, we were talking about the emergence of an autocratic axis, as I call it, the sort of the alternative to the Western-led order. And whilst there is still lots of potential with that, The Economist has a quite infamous design of sort of Hanamei, Kim Jong-un, President Xi Jinping and President Putin as this core. But quite clearly, we're seeing a disintegration of key parts of this. And so if Iran sees a significant disintegration of the Islamic Republic, I'm skeptical that Hanamei has this plan to flee to Russia. I don't think he's that well inclined. I think he's too ideologically driven and committed to his cause in Iran. But certainly you could see the technocratic elements, the president and others maybe making such a move. But ultimately, this leaves Russia incredibly isolated, even more of a pariah, at least in the Western world, and reliant on China. Although it could be a benefit in one way that if the Iranians are so unable to provide any resources to, say, China, then that obviously is a gap that the Russians can fill with their provision of oil and so on. But it's not an easy situation for the Kremlin to be in. And this is going to be very interesting indeed.
As we speak, Chinese, Russian, and Iranian warships have launched a week-long series of naval drills off the coast of South Africa, specifically Cape Town. They started this on Friday. Obviously, this is coming as we're seeing geopolitical tensions amplify, particularly over U.S. actions in Venezuela, which we know that Russia, China, and Iran have been watching this closely. Are these joint drills, in your opinion, really just a show, or is there anything for the U.S. to be watching more closely, you could say?
There's always a degree of performative politics when it comes to military drills. We do it ourselves with NATO exercises. When the Americans and the South Koreans do it, it obviously aggravates the North Koreans. They launch missiles in response. But in this case, it's very important because the loss of Venezuela is critical for the maritime security element, what the Venezuelans were in terms of a huge position, the Iranians, the Chinese, the Russians in America's sphere of influence, its backyard, but also from a critical asset knowledge point of view. In what I mean is that Maduro is a bit of a gold mine for sanctions evasion, for networks of the shadow fleet. And if Trump is going to be upping the ante in terms of targeting these illicit activities by the Russian and the Chinese, then this is a significant situation for them to deal with. And no amount of drills that we see coming off the coast of South Africa is really going to make a difference. The biggest curiosity for me is how the Chinese play into this, because neither
Right.
the Iranians or the Russians really have decent maritime assets. It's the Chinese who have obviously invested a lot more. So depending upon how they behave in these exercises and
Hmm.
what the Americans look at them, I think would be the key angle to look at.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insight.